All right, I think we're just about ready to go with our panel discussion. For those of you who might be latecomers, the panel consists of Arden Pope, Professor of Economics at BYU, Jaron Hansen, Assistant Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry, BYU, Brian Mensch, who is a MD and founder of the Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, Sharice Udell, President, Utah Moms for Clean Air, Kent Udell, who is the Director of Sustainability Research Center at the University of Utah, Catherine Roberts, Particulate Matter Program Coordinator for EPA, Stacey Adams, who works for the DEQ in the Office of Planning and Public Affairs, and Michelle Hoffman, who is going to be our moderator of our panel discussion. And she's Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at University of Utah. And I personally view this as perhaps the most important part of our session of the whole conference, because initially we increased our understanding of the nature of the air quality problem, the sources, the causes, the effects that it's having on our health and the economy here in Utah, some of the unique nature of our geography that contributes to this problem, and but very importantly, we need to address the issue of what are the obstacles in the path of getting the job done to clean the air, and then in light of those obstacles, what can we do to overcome those obstacles and actually create or bring into being effective, workable solutions to this air quality problem. So, and I have a little statement of my own that I thought I would make here before we begin. If we want clean air, we must make difficult choices. We need to, one, make the cost of fossil fuel energy include the cost of cleaning up the damage it has caused and is causing. Two, phase out fossil fuels and phase in clean, safe, renewable energy. Three, use and pay for clean, safe, renewable energy, even if it is more expensive than we now are paying for dirty energy. Four, live near and use public transit. Five, consume much less energy and be much more efficient in its use. Europeans use about half the energy that we do here in the US. And six, reduce, recycle, and reuse. Also, I've added this as my personal view, we must limit family size to sustainable levels worldwide. Okay. Question. Yes, sir?
Okay, you got a lot of brain power up here.
Yes?
You likely will never get this much brain power together again. Who's taking notes?
Who's taking notes?
Good idea.
We are recording this, correct? Do we have an audio? Will we have an audio record of this also? Is it coming through the microphone here? Coming through the camera. Not too great. So please, anyone who is speaking, use the microphone, speak up so that the microphone on the camera can hear what you're saying. Michelle? Sam?
If any of you have problems with parking, which it's not enforced on Saturday, you can talk with Jim or me and we'll take care of a ticket if you happen to have gotten one, but I think there's no problem there. Secondly, since you didn't do a damn bit of good on the dessert bars, will you take them home, please? There are plates and other kinds of things there. Take a plate of them home. We don't want to waste them. So, thank you.
This is a little intimidating for me. I wasn't expecting to be a moderator of all these distinguished people. Maybe I'll come. You want me to sit there?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, trees can come.
This is quite a group to have to try and get to some kind of consensus on. We've got a lot of different silos, scientists, regulators, advocates, and one of the goals here today is to come up with some solutions. And so I wanted to start off the questioning and then open it up to the audience and then maybe augment the questioning as we go along. But I want to start with the question. We hear time and again that air quality is improving in the United States and in Utah, and there's plenty of data to show that it is. And today, Jaron showed us that despite increasing population growth, increasing vehicle miles traveled, increasing energy consumption, we are able to reduce the air pollution. I want to know what it is that we've done to do that and get specific.
Well, a few things have happened. The middle of the 1970s, a big change at Kennecott in terms of putting in smelters and pollution control system on their system out there. It had a big drop in 2.5 Magna and also in the Salt Lake Valley. Other areas are catalytic converters on cars and mileage standards, basically getting rid of the VOCs that are coming from the tailpipes has made a huge impact. So I would imagine that those are, at least in Utah, the two major events that are happening. Now, the question is, have we hit the bottom in what technology can do? And as we now start to increase the number of vehicle miles driven, are we going to see our pollution continue to go up?
I just say amen to that. Catalytic converters have been primarily what's helped us out the most. So reduction in the amount of NOx that's coming out of the tailpipe of a car, and the reduction in VOCs and CO as well. Catalytic converters have been what has primarily driven this. The cars now are 99% less polluters than they were just even a generation ago, a decade ago. So catalytic converters have had a lot to do with that.
I never like to take any position, whether it's valid or not, that excuses our behavior. But there's one thing that probably should be added here, and that is we know from a number of studies that there may be anywhere from 15 to as much as 60 to 70% of the particulate matter over the west coast of the United States, depending on the season of the year, actually is imported from Asia. That doesn't excuse us from solving the problem, but it does give us a little bit of an understanding that some of our pollution problems, particulate matter and ozone, actually originate elsewhere. What that does not mean is that somehow the health effects are less if the problem originates elsewhere. We still have all the health effects. Even if we didn't cause the problem, we will still be the victims. So to me, that suggests that we have an even greater obligation to try and clean up our own sources, even though we know we're not responsible for all of them. As you well know, the rapid industrialization of China and much of Asia, which has happened over the last 12 to 15 years, has meant that their contribution to the overall pollution in the world's airshed has increased dramatically, and we have seen the effects here in Utah as well. But the bottom line there, again, is our health is affected by pollution from China just as much as it is by pollution generated in Bountiful.
Just two brief things. In terms of Department of Environmental Quality and Division of Air Quality, we are up on our regulations. We have a really great working relationship with the businesses that we regulate, and sometimes they don't meet all of the requirements in their permit, and we get to do things like fine them for a lot of money that we then use to put diesel oxidation catalysts on school buses. So we are managing our relationships with business, we are managing the regulation side, but two quick things I want to throw out there that DAQ is doing is that we have a program called Clean Utah. It's a voluntary program for businesses. They come, they get to learn about best available technology controls from each other. They get to learn about what practices are working for businesses in similar sectors. And we also have a pollution prevention, and that we have people in that from local business, from local government, from different community organizations. And what they do is try to share environmental practices. They try to share great ideas. We had one fantastic example from Autoliv, who they create the explosive chemical that ignites airbags when you get into a crash, and they're located in northern Utah. But they had a problem disposing of some of their some of the chemicals left over from their processes, and they didn't really know what to do with it. And as a result of their inclusion in the P2 program, they've met another business who created, I don't know if it was potato chips or what it was, but they created some sort of food, and they had all this leftover oil. And what they were able to do was actually store the leftover explosive chemicals in these barrels of oil for transport so that they could be safely disposed of, and saving both of them quite a bit of money because they didn't have to find ways to do these things themselves. So we're trying to find some innovative, cost-effective ways to get people working with each other, in addition to just being regulated and making sure they're not polluting.
Well, I'm the last person to talk. You guys aren't leaving me much. Fleet turnover, which is what they were alluding to, electric cars, hybrids. I think generally speaking that will help to reduce emissions. EPA is constantly working to identify what we call lowest achievable emission rate, and that is for huge sources in non-attainment areas. And essentially that's what new sources have to meet. And I'm talking about the really big guys here. The other thing is we just initiated a standard for NOx. And that's an issue here for the emissions under PM 2.5. When we say PM 2.5, I don't know if the guys earlier talked about the fact that there are secondary particulates that result with PM 2.5. On April 15th, tax day, wouldn't you know, EPA would pick that day. We're going to be issuing new standards under what's called NESHAPs, and that's a mouthful. It's National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants. I think there's been some discussion here about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's another mouthful. But this NESHAP standard may go a long way towards setting emission limits for all kinds of boilers. Boilers that burn wood, boilers that burn natural gas and oil and coal. And these will be for not just the really big ones, but for small ones as well. So you might want to look for that. We're going to be coming out with this proposed rulemaking on the 15th, and by court order, through a consent decree, we have to come out with a final standard by December 15th of this year. And finally, there's been some talk about retrofits for buses. There's also retrofits for trucks. I believe the state of California has been taking the lead with respect to setting some standards for the trucking industry. And I think EPA backed them up on their attempts to regulate. So you might think about what you can do with the trucking industry. And I don't know if anyone here is from the trucking industry, so. I'm talking big trucks like semis.
Yes, and I can address that.
Thanks for the hint. That's all.
Just get funding for some. Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Does anybody? We actually just had a press conference last week where we've just got, I think it's about $600,000 or $700,000 to provide to the trucking industry for APUs or auxiliary power units that allow them to not idle while they are waiting overnight at truck stops. It allows for temperature control and electricity or electrification of their cabs so they're able to do the things they need to do and be comfortable while they're waiting overnight before they start driving the next day. But that was a big, yet again, another collaborative project. We worked with the trucking industry. We worked with the EPA to get some funding for that. And if we are able to get all the trucks coming through Utah or the trucks that originate from here, we're looking at upwards of a 7% emissions reduction from these vehicles. So that could be a very significant achievement.
Okay. Sure. Okay, let's take this next opportunity to go back to what this discussion we hoped to accomplish was the identifying some obstacles and solutions. And so why don't we start on that end and go start with obstacles.
You complained you weren't the first one.
Oh, now I'm being punished. Okay.
Really keeping us from cleaning up our air.
What is keeping
What's preventing
Utah
obstacles
obstacles?
here in Utah, and if it includes everyone else, that's fine, but mainly here in Utah.
in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I don't really see obstacles. I see challenges, and I see opportunities. And from what I'm hearing just generally from this event today, I'm also hearing that there are a lot of folks who are very committed and interested in trying to figure out a way, not only at a smaller local level, but also at a much larger level, to figure out the best mix of strategies in order to get these emissions, lowered and to reverse this trend. I think generally speaking that, EPA and the state of Utah have recently made some amazing strides in terms of working together. I probably failed to mention when we were doing the presentation that I probably have a conference call every other week with folks who work for the Department of Air Quality, and we are on a very aggressive schedule to lay out all the things that we need to put together in order to have a plan. I do think that the state of Utah intends to have some fairly serious public involvement at various points. I think that they did, in fact, start one process about a year ago. It was a little confused because we started to designate non-attainment areas. President Obama got elected. We had to go back and look at everything. Meanwhile, the state of Utah was right out of the gate in terms of pulling together a group of folks who were interested. They met. Then everything went on hold for the designations for non-attainment areas, and now we're kind of starting all over again. So I would say, to the extent that you can prevail upon your state agencies to set up some kind of community involvement group, some kind of stakeholder group, whatever you want to call it, that maybe gets themselves organized. I think I've already heard already that there is some groups, Breathe Utah, right? That's what you're called, as an example, and maybe that would be a good forum for everyone figuring out some solutions.
One of the main obstacles is preventing us from cleaning our air.
I think one of the most important obstacles is that people don't necessarily understand how their individual actions and behaviors impact air. And I spoke about that a little bit earlier, that people don't necessarily connect running a bunch of errands every single day during the week to increased emissions, or to idling in a drive-through, or to idling while they're waiting to pick up their child from school to increased emissions. And I think that is a tremendous obstacle that we need to get people thinking about how their behavior is impacting air quality. It harkens back a little bit to Ken and Sharice's presentation about sort of the moral, ethical imperative to pay attention and not to take too much from the public commons. And so if we can find a way to help people understand, whether it's an economic way, whether it's a moral way, whether it's something dealing with their children, or some sort of way that will just help them understand how they contribute and how they can make less of a contribution to the air quality problem.
Those of you who know me probably are not going to be surprised that I'm going to take a little more of a cynical attitude. I think there are some obstacles to us cleaning up our air, and they are very real, and they're multifaceted, and I'm only going to mention a couple. I think our lawmakers and our policymakers, by and large, and historically, have a very pro-industry, pro-business sort of bias. And in the arena where industry considerations conflict with public health seems to have, for many decades, been given the short shrift in that sort of battle. If you try and convince lawmakers that there are economic consequences to polluted air, it is frequently a tough sell. If you try and convince them that the public health of everyone involved, including they themselves and their family, that's an even harder sell. So that is a real obstacle. And strategically, when our physicians group was formed, we discussed at length how would we best succeed in trying to help the community clean up the air. And what we decided after a couple of months' discussion was the best thing we could do, acknowledging the political atmosphere of the state, is to try and educate the public and have the public put pressure on lawmakers and policymakers. That's a long-term proposition, but I still think it's probably accurate. I think the best thing that we can do, and most of us here on the panel in particular, and probably most of the groups that we represent and speak for today, probably can do the most good by educating the public, because I think it's public pressure that will eventually overcome the obstacles that we've just identified, or that I just identified at the beginning, to cleaning up our air. I think the public has to demand it, and it's probably up to us to push the public into that sort of a profile.
One of the things I learned today is how much of our air pollution is caused by burning fossil fuels. And so the obstacle is getting past fossil fuels. How do we do that? It's really, really going to be difficult. The number that I saw recently, $780 million being spent by the fossil fuel lobbying industry to keep anything from happening. They're the ones that are profiting from this. We're the ones that are hurting from this. So how do we get past that? How do we force our legislators to start thinking, getting away from a fossil fuel economy and getting to a renewable and clean energy economy? And if we can crack that barrier, then we're going to be probably 90% way forward in terms of solving our air pollution problems.
That's hard being at the end of the line because everyone takes your ideas without knowing it. Well, actually, I was fortunate enough this week to speak to Rocky Anderson, and then right after that, Mayor Caroon. And so I asked them both, what do you think? You know, Rocky was mayor once, and Caroon is obviously mayor now, running for governor. And I asked them what they thought were the top barriers in preparation for this conference to cleaning up our air. And Rocky, both of them quickly gave their answers, which was interesting. And Rocky said that he really feels like we have a transportation issue here in Utah, and that we have this constitutional limitation on the gas tax. So there's a tax right now on our gas, and constitutionally we're only allowed to spend that money on building new roads or things related to maintaining those roads. That's obviously an arcane constitutional amendment that needs to be changed. We need to be putting that money to public transportation development and moving away from roads. So that's what Rocky had put forth. And then Mayor Caroon said, in general, he thinks the public here in Utah thinks we cannot afford to clean up our air. So there's a myth that we can't afford it. So obviously what the public doesn't know is what the benefits are of cleaning up the air, and then who would be paying the bill if we don't clean up our air, and who would be paying the bill if we do clean up our air. And those are usually two different parties, or the parties are different. And so he said that there's a general idea in the public that we can't afford it. So he also said that there's a communication barrier, that people don't know, again, that they can't afford it. He also thought that there was kind of an inertia or a laziness, inconvenience in the population, that people really don't want to change all that much, thinking that maybe their little incremental changes aren't going to make a difference. And then he also said political was the other barrier, that fighting the legislature, he says, obviously is a huge barrier here in Utah. So I would just like to add personally, kind of what Kent pointed on here is, unfortunately, the industry lobby spends, as Kent said, was it $780 million a year, convincing legislators and the public that it's too expensive to clean up the air pollution. What they mean to say is it's too expensive for them. It's not too expensive for us. It's too expensive for them. So I think the industry lobby is a huge problem here in Utah and federally. And then I think, unfortunately, we have a very uninformed legislature. In general, actually, a lot of our legislators don't have a lot of education, in all honesty. No, really, a lot of them don't have college degrees. I mean, I was talking to Mayor Caroon about this, though I should be careful what I say. But I think there's a lack of education by our legislators. So I was talking to Jim and saying, how great would it be if all of our legislators could have heard this presentation today? Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are middle-aged, slightly overweight males that are going to have heart attacks potentially with this air quality. I think they should hear this information just for their own personal health. And that, that might help move them in the right direction. And then the other thing is, I think just in the leaders that do care and do get it, there's sometimes they feel like they don't have enough public support, there's not enough political will, not enough political capital to make bold changes. So in some ways they lack the cojones to say, you know what, our air quality sucks, we need to do X, Y, and Z. I might not get elected because of that, but it's the right thing to do. So I think we need some more cojones out there. And Utah Moms for Clean Air would love to help get some more cojones out there.
Don't clap for her on that. No. middle-aged, overweight man, and she hands me the mic. I resemble that remark.
You're not the legislature.
I'm teasing that.
And you look fine.
It's hard. It's hard to follow that. I'll just only. I think Kent and Charisse, well, all of the comments are right on the money, but when I think of what the obstacles are, I think it's pretty much just what Kent and Charisse said in their presentation. It's that much of the costs associated with some of the more polluting sources of energy are external costs. So the reality is that coal-fired power is too cheap, at least in terms of, it's too cheap in terms of what we pay for it directly, but it's too expensive in terms of what we pay for it overall. So, I mean, Kent said today we don't know exactly what the costs are, and he gave a pretty wide range in terms of the externality costs for, say, coal-fired power and oil. But in fact, and he said something like maybe 30–40% of the costs are externality costs. My estimates suggest they're a little more than that, that roughly, that if we included the externality costs of coal, it would roughly double. Now, in fact, if we really had to pay that cost, if those were internalized, it would make some clean sources of energy look quite good. The reality is right now, our energy is so cheap that we don't, falsely cheap. It's who cares? You leave your lights on, you build houses way bigger than you need, you don't have separate furnaces for different parts of the house that you live into. There are many, many ways that we could dramatically reduce the amount of energy that we use, but there's no incentive. Now we talk about changing behavior. There's not very good examples of people changing their behavior unless it benefits them in some real way. And if the real prices of energy reflected the real costs of energy, we wouldn't be using nearly as much coal-fired power. We'd be using a lot more energy from clean sources. Now, incidentally, there are some sources of energy that are quite cheap that are also quite clean. Hydroelectric is very clean. There are other environmental issues, but it's a very clean way to have to generate electricity. And we can got the same sort of thing happening with gasoline. Gasoline is, sneaking up on around $3 a gallon right now, but that's still quite cheap. It's about the cost, a little more than distilled water. I'm a bit more optimistic with regards to automobiles. It does look like that we're going to have a major shift. Let me just back up for just 1 second and then I'll stop. But the history of air pollution in terms of cities basically went like this. Our cities started out clean, just bonfires and things. They got big, okay? And so they started, space heating started causing problems. Then we started bringing more industry, foundries and things into our cities. Think of London here. And then we had diesel and other fossil fuel vehicles, and it got so bad, with the combination of the three, the space heating, the industry, and the vehicles, made it so bad in London, Denora, as I talked about already, that we said, we can't keep doing this. So we've peeled off our heavy industry to a large degree out of our cities, as we should. It's crazy to have coal-fired power plants inside of an urban area, especially that are uncontrolled. We've shifted away from coal burning for space heating to natural gas. We've cleaned up quite a bit there. And now we're starting to clean up our automobiles. And that's the directions we've had to go. In most urban areas in the US, automobiles are the biggest source of pollution. And the solutions are technologically available to us today. It's just a bit more expensive than the traditional internal combustion engine. But if we really had to pay all of the costs, even of the internal combustion engine, in terms of the health costs, I'm not sure, but I think we're almost close. You know better, you're the engineer here, but we're almost close to where it'll be cost effective now to shift over to actually using plug-in style commuter vehicles, taking electricity that's created away from us with good controls. So technologically, we can have, and our goal ought to be very clear, in my view. Our cities should be clean, quiet, and safe. And all of that is very reasonable. We can have clean, quiet, safe cities. Well, if they're clean, they're healthy. Clean, healthy, quiet, safe cities, that's what I'd like to see. And I think it's a reasonable thing that we can have, but the biggest obstacle, we don't really pay the costs through the price of our energy. We pay the cost through our ill health, and we impose it on those that are most susceptible to that pollution, which actually ultimately becomes all of us, because eventually all of us actually become part of a susceptible group as we age and as our health deteriorates. I'm sorry, that took too long.
So do we start?
Remember one thing, we're talking about the obstacles, and then after we all have a chance to weigh in on the obstacles, then we want to focus on solutions that will overcome those obstacles.
But Jim, I want to have time to ask individual questions.
Right. Well, we're going to 4 o'clock, so we have 48 minutes.
Lots of smart people online.
That's individual questions would be great.
Do we start a petition today, Arden Pope for president, I think? He's so articulate, right? You don't enjoy just listening to him. The data shows that we've collected that 2/3 of the particulate matter that we see locally, Arden's talked about the global picture, but 2/3 of the particulate matter that we see in Utah and in Salt Lake valleys comes from mobile sources and from wood smoke. So whatever we can do to reduce the amount of NOx and unburned hydrocarbons that are coming out of the tailpipe of cars, we will benefit by that much. It's just we reduce it by 1%, we'll get a 1% decrease in the amount of particulate matter that we see. So as Utahns, though, we resist regulations, right? I mean, we're Republicans here, well, most people are Republicans, I'm not. And so we resist these kind of regulations. But frankly, we need a better infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. We need to take keys away from people. Now, it's all fine and good. I think we can stand up and say, look, if you get on a bus to get to work, this is going to benefit people. But frankly, I don't see people doing that, right? Just willingly saying, okay, I'm going to do that. So we've got to include some kind of financial incentive to do that. And how do we do that? We raise the price of gas. You make it so that it competes with the Europeans. They pay $3 a liter in gas. We pay $3 a gallon. There's about 4 liters in a gallon. So if we made gas more expensive, people would, and we've seen that. When the economy tanked just a couple of years, really bad a couple of years ago, when $4 a gallon, traffic went down. Vehicle miles decreased here in the state of Utah. So if we raise the price of gas, and it's going to be painful, but this is how you force people to make alternatives, to buy hybrids, and to take the bus or to walk or get on their bike to get to work. You will force people to do those kind of things. Now, that's going to be difficult. Somebody's got to talk to a politician. And if the politician comes in and ramrods this thing through, I promise he's not going to get reelected. So it's going to take somebody that's willing to sacrifice his political career, if you will, to implement some of these policies. It's going to have to be done by government, frankly. We can go in and we can impress upon people and we can talk to them about how this is for the better good, but I'm somewhat of a cynic. I think that it comes to regulations. Somebody's going to have to pass a law.
What I think I heard you say is it's fuel combustion.
Fossil fuel combustion and wood smoke, that's right, is where 2/3 of the particulate matter comes from now. So if you take the cars off the road, reduce vehicle miles traveled, you'll reduce particulate matter in this valley.
Or burn less fuel.
Or burn less fuel.
And could you please address right now about the question of natural gas appliances in the home. You said that those are pollutant and there's lots better alternatives. What is there to heating a home and what were those alternatives? That came up in Arden's talk.
I think Brian, actually the natural conversion from coal heating to natural gas has been a real benefit. It's helped our cities a lot. Natural gas burning in the home, I'm going to turn this over to Brian, but there is some evidence, and he talked about some of it, that next to cigarette smoking, the burning of natural gas, especially open burning like a stove, is one of the primary sources of exposure to fine particles from indoor sources.
So heating services then?
No, not the heating. The heating is vented quite well, so you're not getting a lot of exposure from heating, but the unvented open stove is a problem.
Cooking
stoves. I've been involved in this effort for about about 4 years. And I started out, and I still do, live in a home right next to the freeway. Worst pollution hotspot in the valley. All my appliances are natural gas. I live under some very powerful power lines. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I don't even want to read any data anymore because it all implicates everything that I'm doing, or not my personal lifestyle, but the setup that I'm now in. So I don't want to say everybody here needs to go get rid of their natural gas stove. That's not the point. I think the point is a broader appeal. And that is, we need to recognize that combustion of just about anything is the problem. Now, I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity to kind of shift gears for a minute. What Dr. Hansen mentioned about the significant contribution about wood smoke is confirmed by other recent studies that have just been published. And there's one that actually goes back to the early 90s, where some researchers tried to figure out what were the sources of the particulate matter in the Los Angeles basin. And they had this great idea that, well, maybe there's some really nasty stuff from the restaurants, the fast food places. So they said, well, how could we figure out what's from the restaurant? Well, they figured out, well, they can figure out how to find out what particulate matter is tied to cholesterol. So they measured the particulate matter that was tied to cholesterol, and they found out that in Los Angeles in the early 90s, they attributed 20% of the particulate matter to restaurants flame broiling hamburgers and other meats primarily. Now, another study was just published that shows there are various ways to grill that meat that are far better and far safer for the community than others. But I bring that up in the context of wood smoke, restaurant smoke. Here are two areas where there's hardly any public discussion. And yet I think there are two opportunities for us to actually push for some legislation that would be relatively painless. And that is, let's phase out wood smoke entirely. Let's give people who are dependent on it a way out financially to something cleaner. And let's do some real serious control on restaurant emissions. If it's that big of a contribution to our overall airshed, hardly anybody's lifestyle is going to be impacted. Now, whether or not we should be willing to have our lifestyle impacted is another issue, and we'll probably get to that. But in terms of things we could do that wouldn't be all that unpopular, might even be legislatively possible, I think those are two things we could focus on and really make perhaps a big dent in things.
Stacy wanted to make a comment.
Sure. This is just harkening back to Jim's question about what kind of obstacles that we face. And Charisse, I'm going to use you as an example, but I just want to say thank you for saying what you do and the way that you do, because many of us cannot. I know I certainly cannot talk about cojones in terms of the legislature. But I just want to give you a context, that it's easy for us to talk about people that don't get it, and the legislature is such an easy target, and we all know the reasons why that is. If you remember Catherine's map earlier, you should remember that the statewide air quality is not a problem everywhere. It's a problem along the Wasatch Front. Legislators who live in counties that don't have air quality problems don't really care about those things because they don't have to. They're worried about jobs. We're talking about communities in rural areas in the middle part of the state who have coal-fired power plants, and it is expensive for them to deal with air quality when that means a loss of job, even one job. Those communities are dependent upon those industries for money. That's what puts food on the table for their families. So, it is a really big deal for legislators coming from impacted parts of the state, but it is not a statewide priority. It's some people don't have the knowledge base that people along the Wasatch Front do. So that's kind of why I would just urge all of you to kind of think about what you say before you say it. It's wonderful to have advocacy groups, but when you go to a legislator, if it's not a big deal for them, they're not going to share the same priority that you do. So keep in mind that when you're out there messaging and you're encouraging people to clean up the air and to take positive steps forward. And thanks, Charisse. I think you're awesome, even though you're
Do we want to open it up to the public questions?
The obstacles. Solutions.
Yes, based upon what we already know about the health consequences of air pollution, can we not make projections about what would happen if a 6-mile-long toll bridge is erected right over there across Utah Lake, probably facilitating the development of a 200,000 home community on the other side? Do we not already know enough to make some fairly firm estimates as to how many childhood cases of asthma, respiratory illness, and death would result from the building of this massive structure? Or do we not?
I think that project specifically alludes to some of our smart growth principles that we need to be advocating for in the future in order to clean up our air, and I'll let all of our panel experts offer their comments.
Well, I wrote an op-ed piece that was published in the Tribune about 3 weeks ago that addressed this particular issue. And I'll just reiterate a few of the things that I did in that piece, and that is, it's almost magical thinking to view Utah's future and unlimited growth of the population, of industry, of vehicles, and think that there won't be profound air quality consequences. And yet, that's pretty much what's happening, in that real estate developers, bridge entrepreneurs come to the powers that be with projects like this, and I can guarantee you there is very little input from people who say, wait a minute, what are the air quality consequences of that project? And there are so many, it's difficult to elaborate on all of them. I'll just elaborate one in Salt Lake that's becoming, or will be becoming very shortly, a very hot button issue, and that's the development of the Northwest Quadrant, which is basically the plan for a city eventually of about 300,000 people, positioned between the airport and the Oquirrh Mountains and I-80 to the north, in a floodplain of the Great Salt Lake. Is it realistic to think that we can keep building that kind of an infrastructure, even if it's a, quote, net zero community, even though if it's low impact and all the homes are energy efficient, and even if they have outlets that they can plug in hybrid cars into this infrastructure? Is it realistic that we can continue to do this and have air that's actually tolerable? We're not even having that discussion. We're not having that thought process. I would personally advocate for this sort of a thought with regard to those sorts of proposals. The air quality now is already damaging enough to our health. We cannot tolerate it to deteriorate even further, and yet we know that it will. If there are proposals like that, and there are a lot of reasons why that bridge is a real problem that go beyond air quality, but just air quality for a minute. If those projects are proposed, what are we going to insist on as a community to offset the impact of these projects? That's the kind of commitment we have to make, and that's the discussion that has to begin right now. We cannot tolerate more projects that will have an impact on our air quality unless we make commitments elsewhere in the community to offset it. We're certainly not doing that yet.
That someone get a hold of me, or Jim can get a hold of me, Westwater, having a specific table at that event concerning that very issue. We need all the help we can get. And the Utah Lake Festival, thousands of people come to. It would be so wonderful. Just get a hold of me because it has to go through me to be approved. But please, one or two tables, I don't care. Get a hold of me. It'll have to be within the next month.
I know that SIP process I pointed out was really dull, but it has real legal teeth. It's one thing for everyone to think about all these great ideas, but you have to find a way to translate those ideas into actual laws that the communities support. So with respect to your issue on the bridge, I can't really give you what EPA's opinion of it is, but I can tell you that when you do the planning for the state implementation plan for PM 2.5, there are two concepts: transportation conformity and general conformity. So you need to work with the, I think it's called, somebody help me here, the Mountain Land Association, and the folks that actually have to look at what's called a budget. The budget has to do with what is the emissions that will be allowed, and this is actual emissions from motor vehicles that can be allowed in order to attain the standard. So the best place, in my opinion, in addition to working with the Utah Department of Air Quality, is to also work with these folks who are going to be doing this transportation planning. You really have to get your voice heard. You have to work with them to figure out the best way to approach these problems, whether it's the specific one that you mentioned or whether it's for future development. It doesn't matter. The good side about a non-attainment area, a lot of people have somewhat negative attitudes about it, but the good side of it is that it really forces the state and the citizens to figure out a way to meet the standard. And there are consequences if we don't meet that standard.
Catherine, will the EPA look at the data that relates to population growth and vehicular traffic and air pollution related with the vehicular traffic as it relates to this proposed bridge across Utah Lake? And will the EPA then be able to say, yes, we think that that data supports, you can go ahead and do it, or we think the data is accurate and it suggests that the air quality changes will be significant enough in a harmful direction that it will not allow Utah County, for example, to get into attainment, and that it really can't go forward? Do you have that kind of key?
Well, I would say that the first step is for the state to come up with the numbers, to come up with the strategy, to demonstrate not just to EPA but to the public how they're going to meet that standard, what mix of control strategies would make the most sense. If in fact they can do that through this modeling analysis work that I mentioned, then EPA evaluates all of those numbers, we look really closely at it, and if it makes sense what they're proposing, then yes, we approve it. If the numbers don't add up, well then we may have to go back to square one and rethink what kinds of strategies make the most sense. But we're too early in the process for me to say definitively one way or the other.
If you're not convinced that the data supports a improved air quality, but it goes the opposite direction, does EPA have the wherewithal then to say, you can't do it?
We will try to work with the state prior to them even submitting a state implementation plan. All of that sort of discussion happens before the plan is even given to us. So in theory, in theory, everyone will find the best possible ways to account for those actual emissions from mobile sources. And yes, that emission inventory stuff I was talking about, that's all involved in that.
I want to give this to Roger because he's the one who did all the work on the Mountain View corridor that I was describing earlier and is an expert in this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I just wanted to go back to the obstacles. And I think the major obstacle we face is the 50 million miles we drive each day. That's what we drive collectively today. And the prediction is, no, in the Wasatch Front. And it's predicted by 2020, we will be driving 80 million miles per day. And I know of cases, even with our catalytic converters, where people have died by their cars running in their garages. So it's not benign. It's vastly improved, I agree, but we are still facing that problem. And the second obstacle I want to mention is that I was at the Wasatch Front Regional Council 2 weeks ago, which is the sister organization to Mountain Lands, and they are doing a next long-range plan for transportation, 2040. And we have been working at this for 20 years to try to get a balanced transportation system with shared solution, with the goal of, rather than accommodating the prediction that we'll drive 80 million miles a day, that we would reduce the vehicle miles traveled. The head of UDOT and in the long-range plan, there was reduced VMT by increasing vehicle occupancy beyond the 1.1 people per car trip. And they objected. The head of UDOT, John Nord, and a representative from West Jordan said, we need to be careful of our conflicting goals, because if we reduce VMT, we will have less gas tax with which to build and maintain our roads. So that is, even at the administrative level of this government, we have been fighting for 20 years to make a goal of reducing VMT by providing a convenient, affordable alternative. Now, we've started with Trax and Front Runner, which is too expensive, and I believe that only by a world-class transit system will we have the freedom of the automobile anymore. But there is a attitude that was, and it wasn't challenged. I think a lot of people raised their eyes when they said, well, I remember at the Growth Summit back in 1997, when Governor Levitt said we had to reduce the water consumption, the head of the Water Conservancy, whatever it was, says, you know, we're going to be in trouble. If we have people conserve water, we will get less money with which to build new dams. So it's the same argument of a consumptive society is a healthy society. I think what we probably feel here is the opposite. But that's a cultural, maybe even cultural, religious, American idea that, you know, the one who has the most toys at the end wins. So I think that, but this VMT thing is I think, the key to our solution, and there's tremendous resistance to that.
Thank you, Roger.
Just to clarify on the bridge across the lake, we have been asked by the state to do a comparison between bridge, no bridge, and air quality. We're not doing a conformity analysis, which our EPA representative knows that's a specific scientific term for a certain calculation that's done, but we did run some air quality models to show that. One of the things that impacts air quality is the vehicle miles traveled. So if you have someone living on the other side of the lake, and they can cross a lake in, how many miles is it? Who's the 6 miles? You go around, it is 12 miles to go up and around versus crossing. So if you build the bridge across, you're looking at half the VMT. Okay, so if you say, well, we want to reduce VMT, then you would probably be in favor of a bridge across there. But as the good doctor says, there's a whole lot of other things above and beyond just reducing VMT. Anyway, what we looked at when we did that is if you put a bridge across there, we don't see a lot of people from outside the state moving over there because there's a bridge, right? We're going to see a limited number of people that may move further south in Saratoga Springs, but a very limited number of the population that we will have in the future. So what we look at is people will be making a shorter distance travel, but they may make that more frequently versus going up and around. So if they're going up and around through Lehigh over to here, they'll do trip chaining. So if you're coming over for a meeting in the morning and you're going to stay for the soccer game in the afternoon, if you have a bridge across, you may make that trip twice. But the VMT stays similar. So when we looked at it, the actual air quality within the margin of error of the model, the difference in the VMT and the air quality issues associated with that are within the margin of error of the model because you've got a shorter distance but a few extra trips.
But what if you don't have, there's virtually no one living over in the central part of the west side of the lake or the southern west side of the lake. You build a bridge across there, won't that open up to development, that whole area, and then add thousands and thousands, maybe 100,000?
We see, yeah.
I beg to address the elephant in the room. There was nothing out there when Eagle Mountain was delivered or built, and they did, when the first, I happen to know some of the first developers, and I'm not a developer, they didn't even have the water rights to develop out there. And look what came. And it immediately blossomed to 10,000 plus. And there wasn't even the water to support that development.
That's a great point, because what I'm saying is, yeah, and that's a great point, is that the growth that's going to occur over there is going to occur over there if there's a bridge or not. But the thing that we see, there may be some limited increase, but what we see is there's not a difference in our air quality that's above and beyond the margin of error within the air quality model. Now that said, with our transportation model that we have, and this plan that we're doing, we are also updating our transportation plan at the same time as Wasatch Front, it is beyond a funded phase in our plan. Our plan goes 2030, our next plan will go 2040. I don't see it being within any funded phase of that plan. If that makes sense?
No. What does that mean? I don't see it. I'm sorry.
So we have different phases that we do transportation projects in different phases. And based off of our modeling, I don't see it being in any funded phase. A bridge.
I'm going to do the gas tax next.
This proposal to do
Okay.
private undeveloped bridge.
How do you fund it?
Michelle, one of the things that I wonder about the elephant in the room is what I was referring to was literally, you're talking as a panel of what drives growth and development, or what are the obstacles, what we trip up over. And if in the state of Utah that is in a high desert and no water, can build whole communities without even water, what on earth is the panel recognizing will either slow or direct or change growth development? I don't care your education level or your lack of education level. In this state, what is going to make a difference? There's the physical ramifications, there's the scientific ramifications, that when it comes right down to it, it's to the property owner. And that's a fundamental premise in the U.S. of A. And I'm not saying yay or nay on it, I'm just saying, really, you as a panel, what do you see being, if air quality isn't driving it, water quality isn't driving it, if quality of lifestyle isn't driving it, what regulation or how are you ever going to influence? Not
Does someone want to speak to that?
Because it's not about a bridge, it's about development as a whole.
Well, right now, we recognize what we do. We build roads and then let people use them for free. So what's the incentive there? It's pretty obvious what's going on. Right now, we tax gas, but we don't tax emissions. You know, so for example, vehicle travels or miles traveled is extremely important, but what would be nice if we could travel those miles with no emissions. You know, when you get the safety inspection and emissions inspection, we shouldn't be charging we shouldn't be taxing the gas, we should be taxing the emissions. That's actually technologically feasible right now. So you tax emissions and you tax roads. If you know, so I heard Charles say it's price. It really is price. You price things in terms of what they really cost. Right now, we tax something else so we can drive for free, right? So what's the incentive structure? It's very, because I won't ask for a raise of hands, but what are we all going to do when this is done? We're going to go get in our cars and drive home or wherever we're going to go, right? Because that's what it is. The roads are free and the gas is cheap, relatively so. Now, it's Oh, we measure the emissions that come out of the tailpipe to make sure we're meeting current standards, right? So what you do is you look at the odometer, you see how much you're emitting per mile, times it by the miles you drive, and charge that tax. And then what we do, see this happened with emissions. We've known this for some time, that it was the big emitters at one time contributing most of our pollution. Well, right now we have people driving cars. They're getting taxed essentially the same thing, but the same amount, but they're driving cars that emit very, very trivial amounts of pollution, and others driving cars that are emitting 8, 9, 10 times more pollution, and they get charged the same thing, right? There's no tax structure or pricing structure to help us out. The whole idea between roads, we say, public transportation's expensive. Well, of course, building roads is expensive. And we just need to make decisions as a community. Now, I'm frankly very pessimistic about public transit. I'll admit that right up front. We don't like public transit in the state of Utah, and most other places they don't either. But I'm optimistic about clean cars. I do think that there is a chance that we are not very far away, within my kids' generation, if not before I die, of driving cars that are clean. And then that begs the issue of, do we continue to have the urban sprawl? Do we continue to have free roads? Those are two different issues. But I think we can realistically expect to have clean cars if we're willing to make the effort. I think that's reasonable. The congestion issue and the sprawl issue, we're going to have to address with a different set of incentives.
Yeah, could I just follow up on that just briefly? It's left the end note of Einstein's quote that we can't solve problems with the same way of thinking that we've used to create them. Let me give you a different image. Say that we did have a bridge, and say that on that bridge that was restricted to electric vehicles, bicycles, and high-speed rail. On either end, you put parking lots that have solar collectors as carports. You could plug in electric vehicle on either side to be able to get your charge. You can do it without any emissions. Now, the question is, can we ever get to that kind of a situation, and would that be worth it at that point to say, we'll give you the bridge, just give us electric cars and give us a toehold into the technology and the infrastructure to be able to move towards a clean transportation system?
So why don't we put it to the panel how we're going to get to that kind of reality, Kent?
Oh, don't ask me.
By the way, don't limit it to the bridge. Let's do it from Payson and clear up to Box Elder County.
We're not
Let's do
just
it on the
talking about
entire
talking about air quality
right.
improvement solutions in light of the obstacles that we've identified. Now, what are workable, effective solutions that can help us overcome those obstacles?
Right, right. And the bridge is actually a metaphor because it's the same thing. We're building more transportation corridors, and whenever we make transportation more efficient, people are going to use it more. That's been our history, and it's going to continue. We've got to get out of that paradigm. It's not vehicle miles driven. It's vehicles that are gasoline powered or diesel powered, miles driven. You know, so if it were electric, it wouldn't be the issue. Sprawl would not be as big an issue if everybody was riding around in electric cars that were powered by solar or renewable energy sources. And so we need to start thinking that that's a new paradigm we need to start considering. It goes to the idea of getting rid of our use of fossil fuels as we are doing it right now.
Okay, you're up there at the U of U. Oh, okay. You're up there at the U of U, and you've got this group that's working on better uses of energy. Sustainability. So do you have a project going on that says, well, let's look at what we could have as a better transportation system in Utah?
No, we don't have a group on better transportation. But it will give you a different kind of a project that does have some input. I've talked to a few people about it. We're putting in a new system now for air conditioning on the University of Utah campus where we are freezing soil deep during the winter and then to be able to use that chill for air conditioning in the buildings in the summer. Now there's an example of zero carbon heating or air conditioning, and we will be moving forward with that this summer. That will be an installation. So we haven't addressed the car issue. I see it as an electric infrastructure.
We've done both in the Grand Canyon.
Oh, well, yeah, we've done both in the Grand Canyon. We've converted the river rafts in a project at the Grand Canyon away from gas-powered boats to electric-powered boats. We're looking at regenerating or recharging the batteries at night by putting small turbines in the river water and recharging our efforts. So it could be done. It could be done. We've got other projects where we're generating electricity by using buoys in oceans, taking the wave motion and turning that into electricity. There are a lot of great ideas out there to get the electric infrastructure.
Transportation is our #1 problem in the state.
In terms of our air quality problem, it seems to be that's what everyone's telling us today, that our mobile sources are the problem.
It's fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels.
It's not just transportation, it's fossil fuels. The whole energy generation.
We don't want 50 million electric cars either. No.
Well, if we were on a wrap-up of what are our solutions, I'll just give you a short laundry list from me. And it's not comprehensive, but some things that we've been pushing for some time. One of the first and easiest things to do would be mandate reduce freeway speed limits to 55. The difference in fuel mileage of car driven from 75 to 55 is about 22%. Nobody drives 65, they all drive 75, if not 80. But the average vehicle will save 22% in their fuel consumption, and that means they'll pollute less. That doesn't cost anybody anything, it actually saves them money. That's something that can be done tomorrow. Time, yeah, we'd have to take a little bit of a different view about our time. That's one thing we could do. Another thing we could do would be to legislate the phase out of using wood for home heating with financial help for those that are dependent upon it. Serious scrutiny of the fast food industry, in fact all restaurants, in terms of their emissions of grilling their meats and so forth, because that does seem to be a fairly significant part of it. That's another. Another concept would be, and there are many others, and I'm going to turn the mic over to everybody else to throw in their ideas, but we talked a lot about solutions. One of the things we need to also talk about is prevention of further deterioration. We did talk about what's going to happen with more growth. How is that going to be managed? We need to talk about some other inevitabilities. Global warming will increase our air pollution. We know from atmospheric chemistry that ozone will be at higher levels just from the same sort of emissions 10, 15 years from now if the temperature is higher. We also know that Las Vegas is aggressively pursuing basically draining the waters out of the aquifers of Snake Valley and most of the aquifers of central Nevada, a landmass that's the area of basically the size of the state of Vermont. You may have remember, what was it, 7 or 8 days ago, an incredible dust storm that the PM 2.5 peaked during that dust storm at over 250. I know personally of a 38-year-old with virtually no risk factors who had a heart attack the next day. That falls into what we know statistics say happens to people as a result of acute spikes in air pollution. It's like the 1952 London fog. It's like these other high episodes. Now, the DAQ admits that most of that dust on that day was from dried out beach of the Great Salt Lake and dust from the West Desert. There was an additional part from a fire that was involved, but most of it was the dust. If Las Vegas is allowed to drain basically all the water underneath the ground of an area the size of the state of Vermont in the middle of Nevada, you can imagine the dust storm of last week on steroids and much more often, and with global warming added to it, impacting existing desert vegetation, whether or not the Las Vegas pipeline ever develops or not, we're going to have more and more of those kinds of events. So what we need to do is not just how do we clean up our existing circumstance, that's part of it. How do we prevent significant further deterioration, which we know will happen if these kinds of things are allowed to develop?
Oh, I forgot the question.
Solutions to overcome the obstacles to clean up our air. Jared, just one sentence before we go there. There's one thing that we're all going to have to do. I mean, we've all done there. That we're going to work within the SIP. There is a SIP process in motion. And what we're going to have to do as environmental groups is become smart on that. And there's going to have to be a bunch of us. We're going to have to learn the SIP process, be involved in the SIP process, and then be willing to litigate. That's what's going to have to happen on the near term. Yep.
So I mentioned it, there was another comment.
Oh, I'm just curious, what percentage of our electricity is actually being generated by wind generation compared to the coal? I mean, it's got to be a very small fraction.
Yeah, we don't have any coal-fired power plants here in Utah County. And for the most part, besides Kennecott, they've got a small coal-fired power plant up in Salt Lake Valley. But we get our power, Delta and some of these other kind of places. So most all of our energy comes from burning of coal. They do, and BYU does have a small coal-fired power plant. But I think when it comes to BYU, they're somewhat responsible citizens. They won't burn coal during the winter, during these inversion periods. They burn natural gas during the winter, during these inversion periods when they know it's going to cause a problem. For the most part, we're not impacted here in Utah and Salt Lake Valleys by coal-fired power plants. The wind blows it into another direction. Other people have to deal with that. But they also have pretty good scrubbers on these things these days. But we get very little wind. But back to the original question, in my earlier comments, I think that we need to be smarter about our transportation. And certainly, it's not vehicle miles traveled per se, it's the emissions from those cars. So if you had an electric car that was driving up and down the highway, you could have 50 million of them. Now it'll be a big traffic jam like Los Angeles, but it's not going to do any harm to anybody at that point. So we need a better transportation system, first of all. The other thing that I would encourage our legislators to do is to take advantage of this EPA's Woodstove changeout program by simply burning wood and pellets in one of these EPA certified wood stoves will reduce emissions by 70%. They're more efficient, they put out more heat with a minimal amount of fuel, and they're cleaner as well. So, and the EPA already has that program set up for they'll give you $1,500 to replace your wood burning stove that you currently have right now. That's free money, so. Good. It's good that we have her here. How about if I pass it down because I'm done talking.
Okay. EPA is not giving any money to anybody. there is no money that EPA has for changing out a wood stove. Where that money is, as I understand it, is coming from is the Farm Bill. There are some incentives in the Farm Bill for folks to apply for. The change-out program that you were referring to is really a voluntary program that EPA has put together. And it really is more of an educationally related program that gives both local communities as well as the state some tools with respect to how do you inform and educate the communities about wood stove burning. And there's a difference of opinion about whether or not pellet stoves or EPA certified wood stoves are a good thing. And I say that with some trepidation because a lot of people really believe in these. The emissions that come from them vary greatly. I don't think a person should assume that just because you have an EPA certified wood stove that there are no emissions. There are it's like something like 30 grams per something or other that comes out of a EPA certified wood stove. One more second here. The other thing I want to mention is that EPA is in the process right now of doing what's called a new source performance standard. This is another regulatory program. And that program, the standard, is under review. And we should have it out for the public to review. And this standard has to do with changing the way that the industry makes wood stoves, or we're tightening it. So EPA will have a new level of a certified wood stoves. It will also apply to pellet stoves, and it will apply to the latest idea that the timber industry has, which is to use outdoor hydronic heaters. Those currently are not regulated at all.
Following up on what Sam said, the SIP process is crucial. And what would you recommend, being an EPA official involved with this, how can we Utahns who are concerned about our air quality, how can we input into the state implementation plan, the SIP, make our voice heard to try to help Utah develop an exemplary SIP?
Well, I think I touched on the fact that there are several points in the process where there is official public comment periods that are that are required. So I would say that in addition to that Stacy work with her folks to find a way to have some type of a stakeholder process. And if you recall, I did mention that in my discussions with the folks that I work with in the air quality program, that they did initiate a stakeholder process about a year ago, and I believe that it is their intention to have another, but I don't want to speak, and say that this is what the state is going to do. Well, I think somebody, maybe it was in your presentation, talked about a moral imperative. And I think that's legitimate. And I would, if it were me, I would, if you had a group organized, look at the SIP, look at the resource you have in terms of this incredible intellectual wealth just sitting in this room. Assign maybe parts of the SIP to whoever really has that expertise and have them responsible for really interacting with the state and understanding the rules and the regulations, and then bringing your comments at appropriate times. And, making sure that the Utah Air Quality Board, has opportunities provided for you to get your point across to them. I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about the Superfund process. In Superfund, community involvement is an absolute given. I mean, it's part of the law. And, you know, EPA for Superfund cleanups, we meet, various folks meet very regularly with what they call a technical advisory group. I mean, there's various kinds of structures and formats and frameworks, et cetera, all across the country that you could use. In fact, even in Logan and Cache County, they have a citizens advisory group that currently exists. So in my view, there's nothing to prevent that.
Stacy, what can the state, the DEQ, the DAQ, what can they do to encourage people like ourselves who are very concerned with our air quality here to get involved, to give our input, to help Utah develop an outstanding SIP?
I'm so happy you gave me a soapbox. So the SIP process right now, we are in year 1, and that's a lot of technical work. What we're doing right now is the modeling that Catherine spoke about earlier. Next year, we're going to start having conversations with the different stakeholders, and in year 3, that's when the public participation process comes in. So if you don't hear anything for a while, don't worry about it. The role for you is about 2 years away at this point. We have a listserv on our website. We have quite a few presentations that have been given over the course of the past few months to the Air Quality Board that give you a background on the SIP, that talk about the technical issues, that talk about the process and the timeline and the need for this, and also the consequences of what happens if a SIP doesn't get implemented. So,
when is the deadline for Utah to submit its SIP or the revision of the SIP?
next year, is that what you said?
December 2012.
Of this?
December 2012. That's for the 2.5.
Right.
Right, 2012. Update us on what's happening with the SIP for the PM10.
Okay, let me give Catherine the microphone in just 1 second, but I wanted to touch on, Jim, you said, how do we stay involved, how do we participate? Utah, what?
How do you get the public involved, stakeholders?
Yes. So we'll come to the different communities that will be impacted by the SIP, that will play a role in the SIP development. And I don't know how that's going to happen. This is the first time I've worked on the SIP. I've only been at DEQ for just under 2 years, so I did not participate in PM10. I can get you the details. However, we have a website, the state of Utah. It's mandated now by law that you can go and see all of the different public comment hearings that are happening, and I would encourage you to look at those things. If you want people to listen to you, you have to show up and be heard. And if you don't show up, why should we listen? So show up. We have a lot of different ways for you to stay informed and for you to stay involved on our website, and I would be happy to give you more information than you can probably handle, so contact me after. And did you have a question?
Brigham Young said the most important natural resource we have is clean air. He said waterways should never be privatized, they should be open to the public. And as a former real estate agent, I always show the real estate agents the fact that he said that property should not be bought by people to sell to those who have money, because that deprives the poor of having homes as far as real estate development goes. But I really think, as far as the moral issue goes, I think that would have, if we could generate more of that out there so we could see that it's part of the moral constitution of this valley.
Real quickly in the PM10, EPA proposed a notice, and we said that we were disapproving the request by the state of Utah to change the designation of non-attainment to attainment for PM10. The documents that exist on this are on the website. EPA is in a formal legal rulemaking process. And what that means is, I cannot tell you exactly what our response is. And there are good reasons for that. We had something like 75 commenters, and for us to go through those comments and get our responses put together is going to take a while. So I can't even tell you exactly when, but I can tell you that it's a high priority, The thing to remember is that the existing PM10 SIP remains in place. Just because EPA disapproved a request to change the designation status doesn't mean that the existing plan goes away. So it's still in force. We just closed the public comment period. Like, I don't know, I can't remember now. What am I, April already? March 1st. We just closed the public comment period. So that means we now have to analyze all of those comments. It's a lot of work to do that. So that's the reason why I can't tell you exactly what will happen with the decision, because quite frankly, we haven't made it yet.
We are about out of time, but do we want to do quick closing comments or not?
Can I give you some solutions that London, that won't involve cojones, okay. Okay, so I just wanted, London, I don't know, it was mentioned today, they actually do have still have an air pollution problem. A recent study that was commissioned by the mayor of London, Mayor Johnson, it was recently released, and 4,300 Londoners are dying every year prematurely because of the poor air quality in London. And as a result of this study that he had commissioned, they also came up with solutions. And so I just wanted to share with the group some of the solutions that London's mayor is working on implementing right now. So a couple of things, and I don't know much about this, but power washing the roads to remove harmful particulates, but that doesn't sound like a good idea in Utah with our water issue. Applying dust suppressants on road surfaces, changing signal timings to smooth the flow of traffic. That is something I think that we really should tackle here. Michelle and I have talked to Mayor Becker about that, and apparently, isn't it the city owns the roads going one direction and the county owns the roads going the other direction, so it's a bureaucratic problem. But it can be done if the political will is there. I think also putting the roundabouts, so we don't actually have to stop and idle. We could remove a lot of lights and be putting roundabouts around. That's a pretty inexpensive solution to traffic flow. They are also planting green walls and trees to absorb particulates and to protect pedestrians in London. They're having no idling enforcement, so they're actually, here we had it passed as a, what was it called? Resolution. Non-binding resolution. Well, we need that's first step, which is awesome that you did that, Patty. But we now need a binding resolution or we need law. Idling is illegal, like they're doing in London. And then I'm also deploying the cleanest buses along the most polluted routes. So, I would love to see all of our buses get converted to natural gas. That should be a priority. So anyways, those are some of the things they're doing in London. The mayor there has taken those on, so they're obviously doable. And politically possible. So I would like to see the same things done here in Utah.
Thank you. This has been a grand day for me. I've enjoyed it very much. And one thing I will tell you that is crucial, we were heavily involved in the PM10 process. You have to know what you're doing. So there are websites, there are documents, you can learn the process, and if you do learn it, and if you know what you're doing, the state welcomes you to work with them. And then in the end, you also, there's always litigation. We've laughed about it all day, but we have to have clean air, and we will have it. And all the solutions and all the talk that we've had, what happens now in the SIP process is, we look at all those. All those get looked at, and you come up with a reduction that's necessary by using this method and this method and this method. And that's where we can all come in, is by having the expertise to be involved in saying, how much can we reduce by this method and so forth. So citizens can have a significant involvement. Once again, thank you. Thank the panelists. Thanks everybody who participated today. And do you see that back table? There are still 3 fruit bars per person and about a zillion pops. Will you take some of the desserts home? I really hate to waste it. So there are plates. Pile them on the plates and take them home, and everybody go home, travel in peace, and be safe.